Our practice is a practice that's quite interested in a horizontal form of collaborations between the disciplines. We're interested in where speculation, reality, and research intersect.
An interest, I think, in where architecture, environment, and infrastructures start to intersect, and how architecture can, on the one hand, engage a much larger territory and think sort of at a regional scale, and on the other hand, how it can intervene in a very sort of pointed way in a local scale.
And making camp is really about maybe a primitive hut project is what we kept describing it to ourselves, about what's a minimal existence in the land. We looked at camping and the kind of phenomena of both family and recreational camping as a very inspiring precedent or attempt of society at looking for a minimal existence on the land.
And I think also it was an observation that in North America there's, well, certainly in Canada and I think even in the States, going out into nature is sort of part of the national myth. And there's sort of two kinds of campers. There's the person that indeed sort of puts on their backpack and enters into the wilderness. But for many, it's actually a fairly suburban experience in which, if you look at campgrounds, it's actually very similar to suburban urbanism, where you park your car or your RV and you're in very close proximity to your neighbor. And so in some ways the question was, if on the one hand camping has become a kind of collective enterprise, how do you emphasize that collectivity, but on the other hand, how do you amplify the kind of immersive experience of landscape which camping in theory promises and which the suburban model in a way deprives you of, because you need a certain kind of context, you need a certain kind of ground condition, you need to be a certain distance from your neighbors. So on the one hand they're intensifying the collectivity, on the other hand intensifying the kind of landscape experience.
You have product designers that design tents and you have parks planners that design campsites. But there's nothing in between the two. So the idea with all of these 5 projects was to look at specific geographies, specific climate conditions, and really custom design a collective form of living that's half camping, half housing. And usually some are under threat because of their remoteness, some are under threat because of their coldness, some are under threat because of it's difficult to root a building in that particular location, and some are occupying habitats that are otherwise maybe unpermissible to occupy. So they're all hypothetical or speculative proposals. There are 5 of them that deal with different issues. This one, for example, is called Off-Grid. It deals with technology and the idea of being literally off the grid. When you go camping, you try to unplug and detach yourself, but often you find people searching for ways to charge up phone or get a reception. So this is actually a very wired and very active technological field, kind of a lightning field almost of energy. There's one that looks at observation, the notion of observation within a forest context. So it's a iteration of the vertical camping. There's one that looks at a product that was called the tensile, which is a tent that uses tensile structuring and suspended within the forest. So instead of a singular tent, the kind of isolated capacity of that, we thought why not a kind of tent campsite or a tensile campsite. This one here is called Closed Loop, which is literally a ringed figure and looks at the water cycle and wetlands. And again, it's quite dense. You can get about 60 campers there, or maybe about 38 campsites. And the 5th one is called Thermal Layers and looks at a cold climate, rocky edge, and is made up of about 3 different layers that you can modulate yourself. And each one comes with their own user's manual, so we made a small set of publications. So for example, this is the one for Closed Loop. So on this side you'll have maybe instructions of what you need to bring to occupy it. You'll have how to organize how to deploy your tent, how does the water access work, or where can you light a campfire. And then on the back side, a representation of the scheme overall, which is duplicated back here. So they each come so sort of color-coded. And this, of course, was in a way acknowledging how when you go to a campsite, usually there's a map and you receive information about local animals and what to do with raccoons and how to exist in the wild. And so this was kind of a spoof on that, but to look at it from an architectural standpoint.
I mean, I think this is probably certainly one of our more lighthearted projects, but I think it taps into a set of interests that we've had for a long time and that I think many other young firms are talking about, which is one, this question of how architecture negotiates environment, literally the kind of physical environment, and the idea of how little and how much architecture do we need in that kind of process of negotiating the environment. I think there's another component to this project which will kind of isn't actually presented here, which speaks to this idea of multiple scale. So a lot of provincial parks in Canada are being shut down because of lack of use, and they're not bringing in enough revenue. And so there's a question of how to kind of re-engage these national and provincial assets so that they, kind of serve the population they're anticipated to, but also remain active. And so the idea that on the one hand you might think regionally about how to kind of rethink their role, but also that these become sort of, acupunctural interventions that would reanimate and act as draws to people, to these landscapes that are otherwise a little bit overlooked.
But I think it's also about asking, and I think the Biennale is asking this question as well, is what's the agency of the architect, what's the role of the architect, what's the scope of work of the architect? And I think in part this is a way to claim an interest in architects to seek out new kinds of work, which is something we do, rather than thinking that there is the commission for the library or the house or the museum. But in fact, architects are not consulted or involved in the construction of campsites. I mean, it's a minor, maybe a footnote in the kind of spatial realm, but I think that's quite interesting, is to use speculation to explore new possibilities or new commissions or new ways. I mean, we know that, for example, part of this project was inspired by the Norwegian tourist routes, which is a very Norwegian-specific response to the wild or the land, which is to make a series of follies that observe the beauty of the fjords. And here, in a Canadian context, what's interesting is to acknowledge the identity of Canadians as being out in the land and occupying the land and being able to survive, survivalist instincts, these kinds of things. And so we were looking for something that was more specific, but we were inspired by a network of structures that were kind of a family, and that you could tour around and go to these 5 sites and put it on your bucket list to go, and that would inspire movement and would maybe have its own economic footprint positively. So yeah, I think this idea of what's the agency of the architect from a cultural standpoint within your own nation, I think is an interesting reflection point for the Biennale.